Hello, welcome everybody to week two of Econ 201. Um, let's just hop right into what we're doing today. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the course, just logistics, key dates. This is a good reference for all you guys. And then today we're kind of just going through a big, broad umbrella of macroeconomics. So we're going to start with the labor financial markets. We're going to talk about GDP for a long time. We'll talk about nominal versus real values, what's a GDP deflator, and then at the end, we're going to do a couple exercises around it, like we normally do. Okay, so reading quizzes. Your first one was due last night. That was June 29th at midnight. Moving forward, they will be consistent. They're going to be due every Sunday at midnight. The reading quizzes for this week are already up, so you can tackle them after watching the two lectures we have this week. The midterm. Midterm will be on July 23rd. This is going to be at 3:30, which is our scheduled class time, and it's going to be on Zoom. So what's going to happen is you guys are all going to join the Zoom meeting, and then from there, I'll open up the assignment where you'll be able to access the midterm. You can write your answers on a piece of paper and then or maybe on your iPad, and then you're going to scan it or just compile it into a PDF and then submit it to Canvas by the end of this class, which is 5:30. I think it's 5:20, but I'll give you the extra 10 minutes, so you get a clean 2 hours. Okay. The final is going to be the same procedure. It will also end at 5:30. It's on Zoom, and the date is August 20th. So both of these, they are Wednesdays. So just look out for them. Be prepared. Um, if I know some of you guys are working and have internships and all that during the summer, if you cannot make the scheduled midterm and final time, please send me an email. I would like to limit this as much as possible. But if you have work during that time or something like that, just let me know and we can schedule a time for you to take it, probably shortly before or after the scheduled time. Okay, but those are key dates to know. I would love for all you guys to show up. That would make my life a whole lot easier, so please do. Okay, the other thing you have to worry about in this class, which I probably have talked about a bit, are these two writing assignments. So the first writing assignment one, it's already open on Canvas for you to do if you want to get started. You pretty much, all the instructions will be online. You're going to take a model, so a graph that I've talked about in this class, and you're going to relate it to something happening in the real world. So you guys are welcome to start on writing assignment one. My suggestion for these two writing assignments is once you get started, they shouldn't take a whole lot of time. They'll take longer than your reading quizzes, but if you sit down for like a good solid 2 hours, maybe you should be able to knock this out. So I would suggest getting ahead of them now and getting them out of the way before the midterm, but and before the final. But these will be due. These are the Friday after exams is when these will be due. So you have your midterm on the 23rd, and then you have to get your writing assignment one in by the 25th, which is that Friday. And again, that will be due at midnight. Okay, so there was a bit of confusion on the Canvas course because the dates were kind of scrambled all over the place. Those should all be fixed now. So everything should be consistent. But this is like the holy grail of all the dates you need to know for this class. Put them in your calendar. Again, the big one is the midterm and final. This is the only time during the term where you're going to have to join a Zoom meeting at this specific time. Everything else will be asynchronous, so you can do it along on your own and such. All right. So there's your course logistics. Now let's get into what we're talking about today. We're going to start with the labor market, which is just going to be a supply and demand. So last week we just talked about supply and demand for a whole lot of goods. Now we're going to talk about the supply and demand for labor. So Similar to the goods, we have a law of demand and a law of supply. How this is structured is it's going to look the exact same type of way that supply and demand always look. But on the y-axis, this is going to be the wage or the salary that you give to the worker. And then we'll still have quantity on the x-axis. So this could be the number of hours the employer is working, or this could just be the number of employers that you're going to hire. So if I give you a high salary, this is going to decrease the quantity of labor demanded by employers. Okay. So if first you're probably thinking, well, if it's a high salary, then more people are going to want to work. And this is true. But if I have to give you a high salary, this means that it's less profitable for me to hire a bunch of workers. So the demand actually works for producers because the producers are going to demand our labor. And then as workers in this model, we are offering the supply. We choose where to work for what wage and all of that. Outside of this, it looks pretty much like supply and demand. So if there's a high price for labor, meaning the wage is pretty high, then a lot of people are going to want to work. If the wage is really low, you're probably not going to get a lot of people applying for your job. And in equilibrium is going to be the same as we've done before. It's just where this supply equals the demand. So the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded are equal. At this wage, employers find workers and workers can find jobs. So there's no friction in that way. All right, here's a nice little graph. So again, want to emphasize wage is on the Y, quantity of labor is on the X, and then the workers are supplying labor, and then the producers are demanding labor because they need the workers to produce their output, which they sell. Okay, so what shifts all of these? The demand for output, education, technology, companies, regulations, and then price and availability of other inputs. Let's kind of just quickly go through a couple of these. So we'll start with education and training. Um, if I have very highly educated workers and they want to work for me for a low wage, we are assuming, and they're very trained, that they can be very productive. So therefore, I don't need a lot of workers. So if you have a very effective training program, it essentially makes your demand for labor decrease in a way. Price and availability of other inputs. Maybe we can talk about like AI here. That's the hot button issue of today that everyone's talking about because they're all scared that AI is going to take everybody's jobs. How this would kind of look here is I don't need to hire 10 workers because instead I can hire six, and then those six workers can use artificial intelligence, and this is going to mean that I produce the same amount with hiring four less workers. And since AI is pretty cheap, this could be a profit maximizing move for me as a company. Regulations get in the way. They set minimum wage. They also set like work requirements, like people have to take lunches if you work a certain amount of hours, stuff like this. So let's look at like lunches right now. I think at least in Oregon, and I'm sure there's some form of this nationally, but in Oregon, if you work more than 4 hours, you're required to take a 30-minute lunch. So how this kind of works is if I'm a firm, I would rather you just never take a lunch and you just keep on working because that means you keep on producing output for me. That's not going to happen because once it hits 4 hours, you have to take a lunch, which means you cannot be productive for that hour because you're having lunch, which is good. This is a great thing. So it's a bad thing for producers, but it's a great thing for the social welfare. So things like this will shift the demand for labor. So in this case, if we introduce this 4 hour wage, what would happen is the demand for labor would increase because now I need to hire more people to get the same amount of output. Okay. Okay, so what shifts supply? Remember, supply is for the workers. So, number of working age individuals. This is just like the eligible pool of people that can work. So, if we're talking about McDonald's and we only have 15, 16 plus people in our economy, then maybe our supply looks like this. Say we get a bunch of migrants who travel into our community, well, then the supply of labor is going to shift out because all these migrants are looking for work and they're happy to work at McDonald's. Um, Required education can be a barrier to people accessing certain jobs. As I'm sure you guys have found, searching for a job, they usually require too much stuff, like 20 plus years experience for like an internship or whatever. This is going to mean that people are literally not eligible to work. So if you have stricter requirements for a job, that's going to shift the that's going to shift the supply curve the other way. And then government policies can also play a role in this as well. So government policies kind of can affect the supply and the demand for labor. Okay, so here we have like an example here. Graph A is going to represent technological advances that may displace workers. This happens when, technology can do the job for cheaper, more efficiently. So cashiers at McDonald's is the example. If you went to McDonald's, I don't know, 10 years ago, they didn't have those little kiosks where you could just like order and you press the buttons. You just had to go up to the counter. So that required a person to be there to take your order and then send it to the people who are flipping burgers in the back. Well, now you can just walk into a McDonald's and you can press a couple buttons. And then the workers in the back just immediately know what you want. Um, Another example of this is like self-checkout. So before self-checkout, you'd have to have more cashiers. Now you can have less. Okay, so what happens in this graph? Well, it's just going to shift the demand for labor to the left because now I don't need to hire as many workers. So this means the quantity of workers I hire, of low skill workers here, decreases, and then their wage will also decrease just because of the supply and demand. Okay, so graph B is going to represent technological advancements, making certain kinds of workers more desirable. So we can think about the demand for software engineers before and after the beginning of the 21st century. For you guys all in school, maybe this is the people who have really good computer skills that have taken computer science classes. And with everything moving in this technological boom, it's very desirable, and it's very desirable because these firms value these workers a lot more than they did, say, 10 years ago. So this will shift out the demand for labor because now these firms really want to hire these people because they can be very productive for them. So this will increase their wage, and then it will also increase the amount of people that are hired. Yeah. Maybe something that we can th talk about though with graph B is what's going to happen after this. So I kind of hinted at this already, but if we have these technological advances, say like 10 years ago, well, now people going to college, they're going to want to get more into this computer science. And so maybe eventually over time, the supply will also shift out for these workers because there's going to be more of these workers trying to get into this job. And what that will do is it will even increase further the amount of people that this firm hires. However, it will decrease the wage. We don't know if it will go up or down. It's kind of just due to the magnitude, and it's up or down compared to wage zero, the initial wage. All right. So what are wages? It's money paid for one's labor. There's a minimum wage, a price floor that makes it illegal for an employer to pay less than that's certainly hourly rate. Currently, the federal minimum wage is way too low at $7.25. Non-exempt workers, employers who earn less than 684 per week or that per year. And then Washington State has the second highest minimum wage at $16.28. But you see minimum wage change even in certain cities. So in Seattle, the minimum wage is higher than this. In Portland, I know it's about $20 an hour. And recently there's been a push in New York to get the minimum wage all the way up to $30 by 2030, I believe. So minimum wage, it's usually a great thing. We'll see maybe what problems it could cause with with our graph. So let's look here. We have a graphical representation of what happens when the minimum wage is above the wage determined by market equilibrium. So in this case, we have the minimum wage set at $12. We have our equilibrium wage at 10. So in our equilibrium, we have 1,200 people working for $10 an hour. Now we have a minimum wage of 12. And so now we have a surplus of labor, meaning that we would have more unemployment, which may seem a little scary, but also things to keep in mind is, say at $10 an hour, people cannot really afford to live. They can't really afford to pay rent. So even though we're hiring 1,200 people, all these 1,200 people are struggling. They're going into debt, even though working all the time. Whereas if we have a $12 minimum wage, maybe people are way better off, and those who can get a job, so the 700 of them are doing a lot better. But we lose all these people because we have 1,600 that want to work, but we are only offering 700 jobs. And then there's also a bunch of different things that go into minimum wage. We're not going to really get too far into the nitty-gritty, but Micro talks a lot about the minimum wage and how actually different structures of different firms can shift this graph, but that's a little bit beyond this class. It's actually more micro, so we're not going to focus on this as much. For the sake of this class, a minimum wage is effectively just a price floor. For those who haven't taken 200, what's a price floor? It means that I start at the top and I try to make my way down to this equilibrium, and I cannot go past this floor right here. So we say the price floor is binding if it's above the equilibrium wage because I keep going down and then I get stuck right here. Okay. Alternatively, we could have what's called a non-binding price floor, which is maybe the $7.25 federal minimum wage, where the wage keeps going down, and then we hit our equilibrium and we stop. So effectively, this price floor is not doing anything. Okay. A big policy question that policymakers talk about is when we impose this minimum wage, is it doing too much of being a binding price floor, or is it just kind of non-binding and everything will work itself out? Okay, so that's enough talking about wages for right now. We are going to move into a different aspect of macroeconomics, which is the financial markets. We're going to have a very simple financial market set up in this class. The more macro you take, the more granular you get into the financial market. If you've taken some finance classes, I'm sure they talk about this a lot. The graduate level finance courses get really into the nitty-gritty of a bunch of these financial markets, how they work, how they relate in micro and macro economics. For us, we're going to have a very nice little introduction. I'm going to give you some good definitions that you should be aware of, some results that are kind of pretty common. So yeah, we'll go from there. So savings is the supply of financial capital, and then borrowing is the demand for financial capital. Okay, so if I currently I'm working right now, say that I want to put 10% of my paycheck into savings. I'm going to put 10% and I'm going to give that to a bank. The bank is going to keep that for me. And what they're going to do is the bank's going to take my money and then they're going to try to give it to other people and get a return back from them. Okay, so by saving my money and giving it to the bank, I increase the supply of financial capital. Okay. What's borrowing? Borrowing is demanding of this financial capital. So say I'm trying to start a restaurant and I need a big loan to get myself off the ground. I love my pizza oven, and so I love my pizza oven. I love pizza, and so I need a bunch of pizza ovens. So to get a bunch of pizza ovens, I need to take out a big loan. I'm going to go to the bank. The bank's going to give me some capital so that I can buy my loan, and then over time I'll have to pay it back. Okay. So financial capital is economic resources measured in terms of money. Associated with borrowing and saving is what's called the interest rate, which is, we can think of this as the price of borrowing in the financial market. And it's also a rate of return on an investment. So right now I have a savings account. It gets about 4.5%, which means every year, if say I just have $100 in there, by the end of the year, the bank is going to give me $104.50 back. Okay. This works the opposite way for borrowing. So say if we have an interest rate of 4.5%, this means I'm going to, and I borrow $100 to buy a pizza oven. Then by the end of the year, I don't owe them $100. I owe them $104.50. Okay. uh, usury laws that impose an upper limit on the interest rate that lenders can charge. Okay, why is this important? Because people can be, they can want to borrow a lot. Um, it's very nice to borrow. It's a good tool in our economy that we have. But if we have these institutions that are saying charging 80% interest rate on a loan, that's not a good thing for us. And maybe as the person trying to borrow, I think it's a good deal, but I'm don't really know what I'm signing up for. There's a whole bunch of there's like this whole thing of paperwork, and I'm not really sure what's going on, but I talked to the guy at the bank. He says, "This is a good deal. You should do it." But the guy at the bank just wants to take my money. So, of course, he's going to say it's a good deal. So these laws can help consumers who are specifically borrowing, can help them make right decisions with this. And it also restricts the banks so they don't screw over the consumers that much. Okay. So let's talk about this type of market that I just described. It's called the loanable funds market. So it's a market that illustrates the outcome of the demand for funds generated by borrowers and the supply of funds provided by lenders. So again, demand, people who want to borrow money are going to demand it, and then people who are going to supply it are the lenders. These are the banks. The banks largely do this, and they do it by collecting people's savings accounts and all of this. So again, pretty standard supply and demand. What's going on right here? The thing that's a little different is here we have interest rate on the y-axis, but again we have quantity of loanable funds on the x-axis. So how we kind of look at this is we say, okay, these people who are demanding these funds, if the interest rate is really low, there's going to be a lot of people who want to take out loans because they know they can pay them back and it's a pretty low rate, right? Like if it's 2%, I'll take $100 and I'll go on this risky adventure to open my own restaurant because I'm pretty sure that I can make back that 2% pretty easily. If the interest rate is 50%, I don't know if I still want to do it anymore because even if I'm very successful, that interest rate's going to eat up all my profits. Alternatively, the supply of loanable funds, think about whether you're investing or not. Where do you want to invest? You want to invest things, put more money with a high interest rate, right? So when the interest rate is very low, you're not incentivized to put your money into a savings account because I know my first savings account that I got when I was like in high school had like an abysmal savings rate of like it was like 0.5%, which is essentially nothing. So I put money into that, and then I didn't really care to put more money into it, to be honest. I kind of was doing it just so I would save some sort of money, but there was no incentive. Now that I have this savings account that offers 4.5%, I make it more of a priority to save that money because I know it's going to grow faster over time when I do so. All right. So, similar to the first couple classes, we are going to be talking about shifts in these curves for these different graphs. So, let's talk about the shift in the demand curve. What's going to happen here? We can have change in perceived business opportunities, and alternatively, another shift is going to be the change in government borrowing. Okay, so maybe let's start with the first one and then we'll go to the second one. It's a little more complicated. So if I will stick with this pizza kitchen that I'm making and I need loans to get pizza ovens so I can open up. If I am going to start it right now, say I'm super happy with like if I get like a 4% interest rate for my loan, that's fantastic. I'm so happy to do that. But now say that there's a pizza kitchen that was down the street from me and it closed. And now I'm the only possible pizza kitchen, I haven't opened yet, but possible pizza kitchen in the entire town. I am more likely to take a higher loan because of this, because I know once I open my doors, I'm going to get more money, more revenue because everyone wants pizza and the place down the street just closed. So I have more market power. I'm going to get more business, right? So this can also work the other way. Say I'm trying to open a pizza kitchen, I'm okay with 4%. And then the place right next to me just opened a very popular pizza kitchen. So now I know if I open, maybe it's not the best idea. And I don't even know if I want to take the 4% loan anymore. It would need to go down very small to maybe like 0% for me to say, yeah, that's worth it. Let's do it. Okay. Um, Next shift is the change in government borrowing. So we're going to be talking about something called the crowding out effect, which is a government budget deficit, is when the government budget deficit drives up the interest rate, and it leads to reduced investment spending. So when the government decides to be the borrowers, we as the people inside of the nation, we are the suppliers, and essentially, what they're doing is they're taking up all the loans from us. So now we go to the bank and they're going to offer interest rates that are very high. Um, and this is called the crowding out effect because essentially the government is taking all of the good loan contracts and they're forcefully shifting the demand in this way. And then it leaves us and not in a great spot. Okay, very nice. What shifts the supply? Well, there could be changes in private savings behavior, changes in net capital inflows. Let's maybe talk about the first one. Um, so in Japan, they have a very strong culture in saving money. They very much value this, which is a good thing. But the problem that they ran into is the interest rate was so low because everybody wanted to save. Um, and so this may actually not be the best thing, but if you have these changes in private savings behavior, I forget what exactly they did, but they incentivize people not to save as much, and this increased the interest rate. Another thing that could change the savings behavior is you, as a consumer, um, or as an investor in this case, you say, okay, like things are going pretty well for me right now. I'm saving at this good interest rate. I'm pretty happy with it. But I'm looking down the road, like 1, 2 years, and I think I'm gonna need a lot of money. I don't really want to borrow. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna prioritize saving now so that I can have those funds in the future. Okay. And that change in my private savings behavior is going to shift the supply curve. This can also be due to macroeconomic factors. So one of my buddies who's studying macroeconomics, he talked about how this change in private savings behavior could be driven by what he called like a news shock, where essentially how his model worked is there's a news that says, okay, look, in a couple time periods, you are going to need to have a lot more money. And so what you should do today is save. And then he looked at how that impact this entire market, and he found that people would save a lot more and a lot earlier, um, which was his contribution. So yeah, pretty cool paper. Um, yeah, for a lot of these supply and demands, though, you can usually use a lot of intuition to justify whatever you want to shift. So I'm going to emphasize this a lot when it comes to like the midterm and the final. You'll be getting a lot of these kind of supply and demand type things, and it will say like, oh, this happens, what shifts? You're going to draw the shift. And I would love you, it would be really good for you guys to explain why this shifts, use intuition. I think what really helps with this is, again, knowing who is the supplier and who is demanding. So for this case, you think about there's businesses, these are people, these are buying houses, right? Uh, Other reasons to take out loans. These are all driven by loans. And then these people who are saving, these are essentially workers who want to save for the future. Um, and then the bank is kind of the middleman in here, where they take the people who want to save for the future. You give your money to the bank, and then the bank is going to give out loans because of that. All right. So that's talking about loanable funds. And now we're going to talk about something that actually doesn't have supply and demand. So that's pretty exciting. We're going to say, how do we measure an economy? How do we know if things are going well? How do we know if things are going poorly? A very common measure of this is called gross domestic product. And I'm sure you guys have heard of the term GDP. So it's the most common measure of output today. And how do we measure it? What is it doing? It's the sum total of everything produced within a nation's border. Okay. So GDP is measured by how much we spend on consuming goods in our nation, how much investment spending there is, plus the government spending. And then this last part is this is the amount of exports we give to other countries. And then we subtract that with the imports. Okay. Um, there are other various ways to measure GDP. This is a very simple way how we go and we measure consumption spending, investment spending, government spending. Those are all a little more granular, but we're going to kind of focus on the bigger picture here. Okay. There's also different ways to measure an economy. There's a ton of ways. So an older and related measure is called GNP, which is the gross national product. It's the sum total of all the goods and services produced by the country's people, whether wherever they or their resources may be located. So this would say that there's an American company producing in China. They should be counted for the how to measure the economy of the United States. Okay. Um, Here we are in uh, this is just a graph of GDP of the United States. It rises over time, very slowly. How we measure the change in it is usually how we measure the growth of a country. Okay, these are, if you guys have not seen these graphs before, these all come from Fred, which is the Federal Reserve um, of St. Louis, I believe. And these graphs are fantastic. They're really fun to play around with. If you want to you just search like Fred graphs, economics on Google. You should pop up. You should be able to find a bunch. Good things to know about these graphs. wherever you see this gray area, that means we were in a recession. So as you can see, this is 2008 to about like 2009 and a half. This would be the housing bubble that popped. And during this region, you can see that GDP, it decreased for a bit. So it increased, and then the housing bubble crashed. We saw GDP decrease, and then it made its way back up. Okay. Another one that you see is right here. You're all familiar with this. This is the COVID crash. Um, so everything shut down. Our GDP plummeted because everything was closed, but then we recovered real quickly because everything kind of opened up. So it was like a baby recession. Right here, this is the dot-com bubble where everyone was super about investing into all these websites, and there was a bunch of companies that were getting founded around technology. And it blew up the stock market, and then it kind of all folded on itself. But as you can see, like even despite that, the GDP kind of was okay through that. I guess something kind of important to know here is when you see these recessions, for example, the Great Recession was a terrible time. It was a terrible time. There was unemployment was very high. People were had to foreclose on their houses. People were very much struggling. When you look at the GDP, it kind of says like, yeah, the GDP fell, but it didn't look too bad. Okay, so this is kind of maybe an indication that GDP is not the best measure for how an economy, how the people in the economy are doing overall. Okay. I will note I didn't update this picture, but GDP did fall in the first quarter of 2025. Um, yeah, so that did happen. And when GDP falls, that's usually a bad sign. Usually GDP increases. As you can see from here, GDP pretty much always increases through good and even bad times, it's pretty increasing. Like the dot-com bubble, it still increased even though it didn't increase by much. Okay. So GDP, again, it's the general measure of the health of an economy. It's used to help countries determine whether or not their economies are in a recession. GDP can also be used as a measure of the prosperity or the wealth of a country. Why would GDP be important? Why would it be important? What could it miss? Um, oh, there's no slide for it. Okay. We'll talk about that later. Okay, so first let's talk about maybe how do we even calculate this thing? There's a couple different ways to calculate GDP. It's the value added approach. So this is the summing the values added of all producers, the total dollar value of what the country produces. The expenditure spending approach is a pretty common one. So this is summing all spending on domestic produced final goods and services, which is the total dollar value of what consumers purchase in the economy. A less common approach is the income approach, which sums all the income paid to factors of production. This equation is the big equation. This is, for all intents and purposes for this class, this is what you need to know about GDP. It comes from this equation. We're going to go into each part of this equation, but this is one of those equations that you kind of need to know for this class. Okay, so let's talk about 2022 US GDP. Let's talk about the components, the percentage of components. Okay. United States, we are a very consumer heavy nation. This is why you can see that the big chunk of our GDP comes from consumption. Okay. We also spend a lot of money on a bunch of different government expenditures, whether that's building bridges, fixing roads, all of these things. We give a lot of money to corporations in the form of subsidies. This all is our government expenditures. That's a big chunk. And then also, we have a bunch of people investing into our nation. We'll talk about this investment because this is a little bit different from the graph that we talked about before. So yeah, I'll be a little patient through that. We're kind of just getting a bunch of different pictures right now. Okay. So components of GDP, consumption makes about two-thirds of the GDP, investments about 15, and then government is about 20%. We have these graphs over time. The left one, not very interesting. It's kind of just constant across time. I guess something a little more relevant today is we have imports and exports. So we do import more than we export in the United States. This is largely a good thing for us, I would argue, because it means we can get goods cheaper here to buy. Um, and while we do import a lot of goods, we also do export a lot of goods. So you see it through the percentage of GDP. I think what's kind of cool to note is like in the 70s, this counted to like 4 to 6%, right? And as we've seen the world become more globalized and it's easier to send goods to other places, you can see both imports and exports increase, right? So, and this is also due to a bunch of free trade agreements that we, I guess, previously had. So yeah, okay. So exports are added to GDP, imports are subtracted from GDP. So if exports exceeds imports, we are in a trade surplus. Okay. This happened in the 60s and 70s. It has not happened again. It's not happening right now either. If imports exceeds exports, then we are in a trade deficit. So we have been in a trade deficit since the 70s. That's okay. This is again, right now we're measuring the welfare of an economy through GDP. This is how they measure it. GDP is not the perfect measure of how an economy is doing. I'm sure we will talk about this. So let's first talk about this investment. I kind of hinted at it. I told you it's not the same as the supply and demand as we did before. So what do we mean by investment? What's an investment? Well, it's not buying stocks. It's not even buying bonds. It's not investing into the stock market like you would think, but it's purchases of new capital goods. Okay. So this could be building houses, commercial real estate. This could be inventories, equipment. You're investing, you're building new factories for your production. These are all investments that we make into the economy. Um, so yeah, this is the investment component of GDP. Is that okay? What is government spending component of GDP? What counts here? So only government purchases of goods and services produce in its in home economy. So the Air Force buying a fighter jet or the state of Washington upgrading the light rail station, which is great. I'm glad they're doing this. These are both examples of government spending. So they're infrastructure related, or alternatively, like in the United States, we have a giant military complex where we have a bunch of these private companies who produce all these types of weapons and jets and all of the above. And the United States government is their biggest consumer. They buy the most of this good for them. So that would be a form of government spending. It's different than consumption because consumption we think from the consumers, where you can think of government spending as more of the being its own consumer. So we kind of split that up in a way. Okay. So Social Security, unemployment benefits, these both don't count. Those are just transfers of money from one taxpayer to another. So there's no production going on, nothing's getting built, nothing's getting produced. We're not buying unemployment checks. That wouldn't really make sense. So those are transfers. These are things that do not count. Like these don't count. What counts, you want to think more of the government as a consumer and what they are buying. So they could buy labor and buy the resources to build a light rail system in Seattle. Okay. Net exports. So net exports is, or what we would call the trade balance, is equal to the dollar value of exports minus the dollar value of imports. So the trade balance just measures the gap between exports and imports. It is just simply exports minus imports. Again, if we have a trade surplus, this means this trade balance is positive. It's a positive number. And then if we're in a deficit, then it's in a negative number because we have more inputs than we have exports. Very nice. Okay. So when we calculate GDP via what we call the expenditure spending approach, you get this equation. NX is net exports. It's just exports minus imports. Usually it's abbreviated to be NX. Not a big deal there. Okay, so moving on, let's see. Production can be divided into five main parts. We have durable goods, non-durable goods, services, structures, and then changes in inventory. So what's a durable good? It's a long-lasting good, like a Toyota Camry or a refrigerator. A non-durable good is a banana that you buy at the store because you can't have a banana for more than 5 days. It goes bad, etc. We also consider it to be clothing. Um, we don't think clothing has the same lifespan as a Toyota Camry, so it's kind of a non-durable good. Services are what is intangible, such as entertainment, healthcare, education. If you go to the movie and you pay for a movie ticket, that would be a service. If you get a massage, that's a service. Structures are just buildings. You're just building structures or you're buying structures. And then changes in inventory are goods that has been produced, but they're not sold yet. So if I'm a firm and I produce a bunch of pillows and I have them all in my inventory in a warehouse, that would be an example of a change in inventory. So if I start selling all those pillows, we have to calculate that in our GDP calculation. So every market transaction must have been both a buyer and a seller. So GDP must be the same whether measured by what is demanding or what is produced, because supply must equal demand. Okay. So here it is on the production side. We have a lot of services that we sell, especially in the United States. You can think of another service as having access to Netflix for a month is paying for a service. Durable goods, changes in inventory, doesn't really account for a whole lot. Structures is, again, building things. And then durable and non-durable goods are split up kind of evenly. So service makes up the large majority. Um, the change in inventory is not shown since it's typically less than 1% of GDP. It's usually a small number. Um, but it's important that we calculate this because if we didn't calculate this, we would get kind of inaccurate results. And people could fudge those numbers a lot, and that could significantly impact GDP. So services, largest single component of total supply, over 60%. Came up from about 45% in the 50s, and then durable, non-durable goods. They're pretty common. Non-durable goods has kind of fallen a bit from the 50s. And another example of like what a non-durable good could be you go and you buy a DVD. Well, now no one buys a DVD, they replace it with a service. So that's kind of happened to non-durable goods. I would argue that's why they've kind of decreased. Again, services are pretty wide encompassing. So this like Netflix is a service. Um, all the subscription services that you have, those are services as well. Um, so if you code and you have to pay for like Stata is a programming language, that would be an example of a service. Us going to education, so UW tuition, we don't get a good back. The only good I guess we get is a diploma, but this is a form of a service as well. So a lot of our purchases are like this. Okay. Um, this is just the same graph. Very nice. Okay. when we're calculating GDP, we have to be very careful. We have this problem of double count. So final goods and services output used directly for consumption, investment, government, and trade purposes. Goods at the furthest stage of production at the end of the year versus an intermediate good. So an intermediate good uh, provided to other business at an intermediate stage of production, not for the final users. So we exclude these from our GDP calculation. So what's an example of an intermediate good? If I am making a car and I'm Ford, so I am Ford right here, I need to buy tires from, we'll call it just, my tire brand, Matt's Tires. I make tires, I sell them to Ford. If we're counting the GDP, and say Ford gives me $4,000, 4K for their tires, and then Ford goes and sells that car for 20K. What we're doing is we are going to double count my tires because my tires go into the Ford truck, which rationalizes the price of 20K. If the Ford truck did not have tires, it would go for it would go for 16K. And then he would come to Matt's Tires to buy his tires, right? So for GDP, this should just be 20K. If we say it's 24K, then we have the problem that we're double counting. So it's counted more than once as it travels through the stages of production, as you see from that example. So it's a potential mistake to avoid in measuring GDP. Again, GDP is the dollar value of all the final goods and services produced in an economy in a year. Okay, so another kind of example of this could be any input to a final output. So, for example, if I produce glass and then I sell that glass to this straw manufacturer, I don't want to calculate the purchase from that company for the glass. I just want to say, what is the value of that straw? Yeah, that example works. Okay, income approach. So it just measures GDP by adding the total factor income attributed to each firm. So it's important not to double count again. Purchase of intermediate goods should be omitted since this would be double counting. And here we have like a nice example with steel where we do not want to double count. Yeah, very nice. All right. So let's move on here. Now we have a table, which is fantastic. So what's going on in this table? We have these three companies, ore, steel, and motors, and we have total factors to income. So we have wages, interest payment, rent, profit, total expenditure by the firm, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so the value of production of final goods and services is the sum of the total value added. So the total value added is given right here at the bottom. It's summing all these up. So how do we arrive at this? Well, I know that the value of this ore is 4,200. Okay. So we take 4,200, perfect. But that goes into steel, and I know steel sells for 9,000. So I can't put 9,000 down at the bottom here because what I want to put down at the bottom is 9,000 minus 42, 4,200. And that is the value added of that firm because that firm took 4,200 and it converted it through its production to make it 9,000. So that's where you get the 4,800. And then we do the same exact thing for the car because they take the steel and that's where you get 1,250. So you add all these up together and you get 2,150. It also is just the value of the final good, which is how we typically calculate it because doing this calculation at the bottom here can be a little tough. Another way, so the income approach says we can find the same exact number by just doing the wages plus the interest payment plus the rent plus the profit. We add all those up, we get the same exact number. Okay. Uh, I would argue this is the best way to do it. This is usually the easiest way to do it as well, and it happens to be the most accurate. Okay, so nominal versus real. So the economic status statistic actually announced at that time that isn't adjusted for inflation. Not adjusted for inflation's a big deal. Okay, and then the real value is the statistic after it's been adjusted for inflation. We only care about the real value. Okay, so think about it like this. If we have, um, we can have two countries here. We can have country A and country B. Okay, and then we say their nominal GDP is 10 and this is 2. So you look at their nominal GDP and you're like, I don't know, country A looks pretty good. They seem to know what they're doing. But then you maybe go to inflation number, and this inflation is at 10,000%, and their inflation is at 3%. Okay. So their nominal GDP is $10. The only reason it's $10 is because their inflation is so high. So this is like they bought a stick and then they go back and their value for their money has just disappeared. Okay. So the stick sell that used to sell for $1 is now worth $100 because the dollar just doesn't mean anything anymore because inflation is so high. So when we're comparing countries specifically, and also when we're comparing a country over time with itself, it's important to account for inflation and not just talk about the nominal number because the nominal number doesn't really tell the whole story, right? If we have massive inflation over time, then the GDP is going to go up, but possibly the real GDP will go down. Okay. So here's a graph of nominal versus real GDP. So as you can see, nominal, it always goes up. Very nice. Okay. And then here we're looking at the real GDP, which tends to be a flatter line because it's adjusted for inflation. So how do we do this? Well, we convert all the dollar values are converted to, in this case, we pin a year. In this case, we're pinning 2012. You can see we pin 2012 because at this year, nominal and real GDP are the same. So that means the value of the dollar in 2012, um, so real GDP is the same as nominal GDP. Okay. So why is this important? Well, here you look at nominal GDP is very small in 1960, but you see that real GDP is very large. Why is that? Because $10 in 1960 is probably worth $50 today. Okay, so the real GDP adjusts for that. Okay, so real GDP will appear higher than nominal in the years before 2012, and then because dollars are worth less in 2012 than in previous years, and then on the flip side, um, dollars are worth more in 2012 than in later years, unless you have deflation. We don't have deflation though, so we don't worry about that. So that's why you see they intersect, and now real GDP is lower than the nominal GDP. Okay. What is the GDP deflator? Well, it measures the price level by calculating the ratio of nominal to real GDP. And then we multiply that by 100. So again, we are sticking with our base year of 2012, which means at 2012, we have a GDP deflator of 100. How do we get this? Well, the nominal is the same as the real GDP. So this is essentially like 1,000 divided by 1,000 times 100. So that will equal 100. Okay. Um, and then we can map all these other GDP deflators along with that. So a GDP deflator, it's a price index, measures the average price of all goods and services included in this economy. This is also another graph that you can find on Fred if you're interested. It's a way to measure inflation in a certain way. So GDP. deflator includes only domestic goods and not anything that's imported. The deflator is a measure of the prices of all domestic goods and services, but it's n not like the consumer price index, which we'll talk about later. So I guess the big thing here to emphasize, we're not talking about imported goods, we're talking about goods that are made in our country with GDP deflator. How do we measure real GDP? We are going to take the nominal GDP, which is a number we can find very easily, and then we're going to divide it by the price index. The price index will be something that is given to you in terms of a number, so you don't need to worry about calculating that. So the price index could be the GDP deflator, it could be the CPI, it could be the PPI. There's a bunch of different ways to do it. I'll tell you which one to do, and then you just plug in the numbers. So for simplicity, the price index is traditionally published after being multiplied by 100. Then you just get a full number. So that's always a good idea. They have this divided by 100 here. I don't like how they wrote this equation. Just multiply it by 100. Take nominal GDP divided by the price index, multiply it by 100. It's the same exact thing. They just wrote it in kind of an odd way here. So whenever you have a real statistic, it's computed 1 year or period is called the base year. The base year is the year whose price we use to compute the real statistic. So if we want to know what the GDP was in 1858 in terms of 2023 dollars, we choose 2023 as our base year. This is kind of good terminology to know. We pick a base year in the slides before. We picked our base year of 2012. Now we're picking it in 2023. So we'll use the CPI or the GDP deflator for 2023, and then we'll talk about what GDP was in 1858, I guess. Okay, so here's an example of how we can calculate it. They do a nice little calculation. So because the real GDP to calculate the real GDP in 1960, we're going to take the nominal GDP in 1960, which is given as 543.3, and then we're going to divide it by our price index, which is 19, and then we'll multiply it by 100, and that's going to give us this number here. Okay. So I think if you guys are struggling with this a bit, try to take 2010. I guess you can see how to do it right here, but throw it into your calculator and make sure you can get the real GDP given right there for 2010. Yeah, so that's probably a good exercise for you guys to do. I bet you'll do this on homeworks too, so you can just save it for that if you want to. Here's how you do it for 2010 if you didn't pause the video. If you didn't pause the video, I'm disappointed. Just kidding. No, it's fine. But this is, yeah, so we do essentially the same thing where you take nominal GDP, you divide it by the deflator, and then you multiply it by 100, and then you get your real GDP. Okay, so as long as inflation is positive, real GDP should be less than nominal GDP in any year after the base year. Okay, inflation's always been positive. There's nothing to worry about there. Okay. So real and nominal GDP growth. There are two ways in calculating the GDP growth rate. So we have real GDP growth, which is inflation adjusted GDP growth rate using the price of the base year. And then nominal is just we don't adjust for inflation. So you'll see this come up a bunch. If we talk about real, we always adjust for inflation. Nominal, we don't adjust for inflation. And GDP growth means we're just looking at how GDP changes over time periods. So here we have a nice little table. Okay, so we have I guess in this economy, we are selling apples and bananas. Okay, very nice. First of all, let's see, like, in this very simple economy, how are we going to calculate the GDP? How do they get this 1,000 for year one, for example? Well, they take the quantity of apples, they multiply it by 0.25, and then we take 1,000 times 0.5, and that will give us 1,000 because this is just 500 plus 500. Okay. So in our very simple economy, this is the GDP because we are only selling apples and bananas. Okay. Uh, in the next year, we see that we sell a little more apples. The prices increased a bit. We sell a little more oranges. The prices increased a bit. So now our GDP is 1,500. We are going to take the base year of year one to measure the real GDP of year two. So the base year had us at the base year, because we're taking 2010 as the base year, that's 1,000. So the real GDP increases a bit. I'm sure we're going to show these calculations. Uh, we are not. That's okay. You'll have examples with this. I'll save it for that. Okay. So let's calculate the real GDP growth rate. How do we do this? This is more the focus. Well, we just essentially compute the percentage change in this number. Okay, so we're going from 20, we're looking at the growth rate from 2010, from 1960 to 2010. Okay, so we're going to take the real GDP from both of these, and we're going to look at the percentage change, which I like to use as this, kind of like this equation. Um, New minus old over old. Okay, it's a great way to think about percentage change. You take your new number, which is our GDP from 2010, you subtract it with our old number, which is our GDP from 1960, and then you divide it by our old number, which is the GDP from 1960. And you do this and you say, wow, our economy has boomed since 1960 by 376%. So the US economy increased real production of goods and services by nearly a factor of 4 since 1960. This makes sense. Um, the further back you go when you compare the growth rates, it will be a higher number. So if we compare the GDP growth rate from today and yesterday, it would be a very small number. Okay. Well, it's tracking real GDP over time. So the governments report GDP growth as an annualized rate. When analyzing growth in a quarter, the calculated growth in real GDP for the quarters is multiplied by 4 when it's reported, as if the economy were growing at that rate for the full year. If we're in a recession, we have a significant decline in GDP. And countries are going to define recessions differently. I think technically we define a recession if we have negative GDP growth for 2 consecutive quarters. I believe is how we calculate it here. But also there's a bunch of different metrics to calculate if we're in a recession or about to even go into a recession. A depression is an especially lengthy and deep decline in output. So we have not had a depression since the 1930s, I think. But that's when we had GDP falling for a very long time. So depression is just a very, very bad recession. Okay, let's see. Do we see it? You can't see it. So if we look at GDP in like the 1920s to the 30s, remember the recession started right here. So we'd see a big decline right there. Okay. Real GDP in the United States, though, in 2020 is about $18.4 trillion. It's a giant number. It's grown since then. After adjusting to remove the effects of inflation, this represents roughly 20-fold increase in the economy's production since 1930. So we have grown a lot since 1930. We have developed a lot. A lot has changed in the world since 1930. So this makes sense. Okay. Patterns of recessions and expansions. So we typically believe that the economy follows what we call a business cycle. And essentially, a business cycle is we take GDP, we calculate like a straight line like this, and then our economy kind of looks, our real GDP kind of looks like this. Okay. So if we're at a peak, this means During the business cycle, the highest point of output before a recession begins, that would be like right here, here, and here. A trough is the bottom, so these would be troughs. Boom, boom, boom. Again, these are peaks. Boom, boom, boom. So a recession lasts from peak to trough, which is right there. And an economic upswing runs from trough to peak. So that would be something like that. Okay. So typically, we believe this is how markets kind of work. They kind of get really hot, and then they get a little too hot, and then things slow down, and then they heat back up. Okay? As a policymaker, we generally know that this is upward sloping most of the time. So what we try to do is we try to compress it, make it so the the upswings are manageable and don't get out of hand, and the recessions are short and don't hurt as much. Okay, let's talk about a measure which I believe is way better than just GDP, and this is GDP per capita. So the US economy has the largest GDP in the world. However, there's a lot of people that live in the United States, so I would hope so. If our GDP is very low, that would be quite alarming. So, is its economy also larger on a per person basis? This is the question that GDP per capita asks. How do we calculate it? We just take the GDP, we divide it by how many people we have in the country. Okay. And look, we have this very nice graph here. So let's find the United States. We're at the bottom here. Our GDP is this giant number. We have a lot of people here. So our GDP per capita breaks around to $63,000, 63K. And in this graph, we still beat everybody. Are they going to show? Oh, they're not. Okay, the highest GDP per capita country is a very small country. It's a very small country in Europe, I believe. And they or and then there's also a couple Middle Eastern countries that have very high GDP per capita because they have a lot of oil money and not a lot of people. Um, so I guess Um, when we're talking about how well does GDP measure well-being of society, the standard of living is like all elements that affect people's happiness and well-being, whether they are bought and sold in the market or not. So difference between GDP and standard of living is GDP does not include how much leisure time people have. We have very different work culture here in the United States versus in Europe versus in other places of the world. It does not include the actual levels of environmental cleanliness, health, and learning, production that is not exchanged in the market, the level of inequality in society, and what technology and products are available. So, for example, that country that's slipping my mind, I'll have it for you by next lecture, where that has a very high GDP per capita. They also have very high inequality because it's a couple people at the top making a lot of money and a bunch of people at the bottom. Okay, so GDP per capita is, I would argue, better than GDP because it kind of gives you more of an idea of how well an economy is doing given their population, but it's still not perfect, mostly because of this inequality thing plays a role. But then when we're also talking about all aspects of a society, we want to talk about how's their healthcare system? Is it okay? Do people get it for free? Do they not? Um, are the streets clean? Is it safe to go outside after dark? All these things obviously go into how well an economy is doing. So GDP, while it's a good measure of how well an economy is doing, more as like a business, it's not the best when it comes to how are the people in that country doing. Um, so it's a good measure. It's been a measure for a while, but it's not perfect. Okay. Okay, now let's move on. So what are we doing now? For this question, we're going to refer to figure one. which is above, and we're going to look at the growth rate of nominal GDP between 2014 and 2015. And then we're going to use 2014 as our base year, and we're going to calculate the growth rate of real GDP between 2014 and 2015. Okay, so let's start by just calculating a bunch of these numbers. So to calculate the GDP, the nominal GDP, so nominal GDP 2014, what we're going to do is we're going to take the quantity of iPhones sold and we're going to multiply that by the price plus the amount of iPads times the price plus the Kindles times the price. Okay, and then we're going to all throw that into our calculator. And this is going to give us 1 second. 150 times 1220. 150K is our nominal GDP for 2014. 2015, we are going to do the same exact thing. I'm not going to write it out because it's just the same exact thing. So when we throw these into a calculator, we get 171,375. So this is nominal GDP for 2015. Okay, boom. So now we want to find the growth rate of nominal GDP between 2014 and 2015. How we're going to do this is we are going to use our equation, which is new minus old over old. So we take 171,375. That's our new number. We subtract 150. That's our old number. And then we divide it by our old number, which is 150. Okay. And then we'll multiply this by 100. And that gets us 14.25%. So this is the nominal growth rates between 2014 and 2015. Okay. Very nice. Okay, so that is the first part of this question right here. And now I am going to erase all of this because we need to, let's see, so, nominal GDP 2015, 150K. Nominal GDP. Oh, this is 2015. This is 2014. 171,375. Okay. So now we're going to find we're going to use 2014 as our base year, and we're going to calculate the growth rate of real GDP between 2014 and 2015. Okay, so how we're going to do this, for the sake of this class, I'm just going to teach you how to find the real GDP in 2015, and I guess 2014 as well, and then we'll just use the new minus old equation. So since we're using 2014 as our base year, the real GDP is going to be 150K. Okay. Now, how do we calculate the 2015 real GDP? Well, we are going to take the quantities in 2015 and we're going to calculate them how we have calculated nominal GDP, but we're going to use the prices in 2014 because that's our base year. Okay? So that's going to be 65 times 200 plus 600 times 225 plus 120 times 225. Okay, very nice. And this is going to be plus 600 times 225 plus 120 times Okay. And this we get 175K. So that is the real GDP. Okay, and now we're just going to use new minus old over old. Multiply that by 100. So we take 175 minus 150 equals that divided by 150 times 100. And we get 16.67%. So this is the growth rate. Okay. It's a very good skill to learn how to find, calculate the real GDP with these tables. So like this is a very common question that you'll probably get asked. And the key here is, again, we take the quantities in 2015, but we use the prices for 2014. We do not use the prices for 2015 because 2014 is our base year. Okay. So I think the big thing from here, finding the growth rate is great. You're going to need to get very comfortable using this equation as well. This step though is this is pretty crucial to understand. This will come up a lot. Uh, let's skip past that one. Okay. So let's talk about this value added GDP. There's an economy with two firms, one of which makes an intermediate good, the other uses to construct the final good. Very nice. And we have to complete the table, the following table below. Okay, so um, let's see what's happening. So we have firm one, they make the intermediate good, they sell it to firm two. Okay, so firm one is going to take, they're good. They're gonna make it. We can think about this as they are the tire maker, and so the value they add is they add 4,000. We're not assuming there's someone before them. Okay. Um, we can see this because their inputs are zero. Okay. Firm two is going to buy my tires, and then they are going to sell the car for 15K. So how much value did they add? They added 15K minus 4,000. Okay. And that gives us 11,000. Very nice. Okay. So there's a couple other things that we kind of need to add in here, such as labor, rent, and I guess profit. Okay, so the profit overall, this is kind of a puzzle in a way. Profit overall is 2,500. So the first firm made 500. So this has got to be 2,000. Okay, very nice. And then profit is calculated by the sales. So profit we denote usually with pi. It's the sales, which is 1,500, minus the cost of our inputs, minus the labor, um, minus the interest. And I know this has to equal 2,000. And then this, I'll call it R. R is the rent. So that could be another cost. So we take the right-hand side. The right-hand side, we get 3,250 minus R equals 2,000. Okay. And then we just solve for R. So I'll add R on both sides. I'll subtract 2,000. You get 3,250 minus 2,000. And this gives us 1,250. Now we can use this to find the rent for the other person, which is 750. And again, now we just need to do the same type of profit calculation. So the profit for firm one is their profit is 500. And this is going to equal the sale, which is 4,000, minus our inputs of 0, minus the labor, minus the rent, which we've calculated to be 750, minus interest, minus, that's it. That's it. Okay, so we take 4,000 minus 750 minus 600. This gets us 2650 minus our labor cost equals our profit. And that's going to give us 2150. So the total labor cost is 9150. The interest is going to be 1350. Uh, that's a 9. Yeah, okay. And then, yeah, now we're good. Okay. So it's kind of a mess to fill out these tables. Sometimes, I guess, a good thing to know for all these is like they have to add up horizontally. So like 600 plus 750 has to equal that amount. These two numbers have to equal that. And then when we're going vertically in this, what's important is that profits, which I'll just write like this, it equals sales minus all of this, all of those columns. Okay. Um, so calculate the GDP in this economy and show that the payments to factors of production, spending, and total values are equal. Okay, what's the GDP? GDP, sale, the final good, should be 15K. Okay. Now we get to see if we did this right. So if we add these, the labor, the rent, the interest, and the profit, this equals 15K. If we look at the value added down here, this sums to 15K. So we know that we are all good to go and we filled it out all right. Okay. I think this was a longer lecture. So again, this lecture, we started talking about labor, the labor market. Then we talked about the investment market, and we spent a lot of time on GDP. These examples right here, specifically exercise 1. Exercise 2 is more of an extension of exercise 1. You're welcome to try this at home. This is a good one to solve. And this one, I'll talk about it a bit. We're talking about the GDP deflator, so you can find the equation for that in the slides. And then exercise 3 is more of like this table type of problem. Also a very good one to look at, solve on your own. Okay, so that's all that I have for this lecture. I will see you guys for week 2, part 2, coming to you on Wednesday. All right.